Nathaniels disappeared on December 19th, 2017.
He just vanished, and he was just nowhere to be found.
Inside my body, I knew something was wrong, and I knew that we needed to find him. It is the worst feeling you can have as a mother, to not know where your child is.
His family is desperate for answers.
He started doing cocaine quite frequently. He would break down crying, telling me that he didn't know how to stop.
I think that he probably told us things that we wanted to hear or wanted to believe. And I think there's probably some things that we missed.
This episode of Disappeared retraces Nathaniel's last known steps.
One of my fears is that somehow he got into these drugs and ended up owing these people money.
It can be very dangerous for somebody who hasn't been on the streets much.
This person in Oceanside said that a man asked to borrow her phone. He just Googled the name Nathaniel Holmes.
I thought, could this be him? Could this be the day we find him?
The more people who know Nathaniel's story, the greater the chance of bringing him home.
My name is Wendy Keetle, and Nathaniel is my son. The last time I saw him was on December 19th, 2017, and he's still missing. Nathaniel lived in the Westminster, Colorado area since he was born with his older two sisters and younger brother. Nathaniel was a great brother to his siblings. Him and his younger brother Seth played all the time. He loved Legos. He was always very respectful. He was never argumentative, just a very, very good kid. All of his brother and sisters, they all got along great, and they just had a good time.
My name is Ben Holmes, and I'm Nathaniel's father. Nathaniel, as a child growing up, he enjoyed music, hunting, and travel. He enjoyed doing a lot of things in his earlier years, baseball and things like that. And unfortunately, Nathaniel's mother and I divorced in 2009.
He was around 9 years old. It did affect him a lot. He was very much a mama's boy, and it was very hard on him to go through that event. We tried as best we could to make it as comfortable for him and make him know that he was loved by both his dad and myself. Nathaniel, as he got older, started to play the bagpipes like his father, and that was a really big part of his life.
He learned bagpipes at a remarkably quick rate, and he went from a very beginner status to a very accomplished status in a shorter period than I've ever seen anybody else accomplish that. One of my proudest moments of my life was playing bagpipes with Nathaniel at the Colorado Renaissance Festival, playing a tune that I wrote with my son. It was amazing.
Nathaniel, he's very smart, he's very intelligent, but school was something that was kind of at the bottom of the list for him. He would get bored, and then it would just kind of go sideways for him.
He was very bright, and he would pick things up quickly, but sometimes the pace was a little slow for him, so he would get distracted. And while he's interested in things, he would get distracted from his scholastic endeavors.
So Nathaniel was not doing great in public school. We thought that it was maybe too much pressure, just too many people. It just wasn't something that he enjoyed. So when he got into high school, we did try online school, which did not work because he was not self-motivated. So we put him in an alternative school.
At this point, Nathaniel was a junior in high school. School made promises that he could catch up on classes, that he would be on track for high school graduation. So we were very positive that he could, get his diploma and move forward from there. My son had a small group of friends, and he met a couple at his newer school, and I think they may have been a bad influence on him.
But he seemed to be less focused, and you could tell that maybe he was doing things he shouldn't be doing. We thought maybe he was dabbling in some marijuana and some other things like that.
Monday, the 18th, his behavior was quite unusual. He came home and he was very definitely chemically altered. I'd never seen him like this before, and I talked to him about that, and he said that he had tried some marijuana and he took a Xanax.
His dad was very frustrated because we thought that Nathaniel was on the right path. He had asked Nathaniel, you know, where are you getting this? What are you doing with this? What are you doing? And he just shut down.
And I said, this isn't behavior that's tolerable. You know, we can't do this kind of thing. And he did get in quite a bit of trouble. I was working that evening, so I sent him to his mother's to stay.
His dad did call me that afternoon and said that Nathaniel had taken some Xanax pills, so Nathaniel needs to stay with you tonight. Talk to him, you know, kind of try and get him in his right space. So he came to the house, we ate dinner. You could tell he was in a different zone. And said, Nathaniel, you know, this is not a path for you. You're too smart for this. You know, we wanted to make sure he was safe, but I was concerned. I did find a few pills in his wallet. I didn't really even know what they were, quite honestly, but I just took them from him and I said, you know what, you don't need this. And he got really, really worried, really almost scared, and said, I have to take those back to school. He goes, Mom, you can't take those. And well, I did, and I hid them, and I sent him to bed. The morning of the 19th, I got Nathaniel ready, took him to school. I sat in my car and I watched him go through the school doors, and I left. After I dropped him off, I went to work. I would say around 10 o'clock in the morning, I got a call from Nathaniel. He did not have a phone at that time. I believe it was broken and we didn't get him another phone. So he did not have any way to communicate with us other than, you know, a friend's phone. I just assumed that he used a friend's phone from school. And he said his friend Michelle was going to pick him up for ice cream after school. This was a friend of his father's. And I said, okay, well, I'm gonna give her a call, and if she's gonna pick you up, then that's fine. And he said, okay, I love you. That was the end of that conversation. So immediately I called Michelle and I said, hey, Nathaniel said that you're gonna pick him up for ice cream. And she goes, no, I haven't talked to him for a few weeks. And I said, okay, that's weird. And so then I called his dad and I said, hey, Nathaniel said Michelle was picking him up. I'm gonna go to school an hour early and pick him up and just make sure that he doesn't try and go out the back door or do something with his friends or whatever's happening. So that's what we agreed upon. So I stayed at work, and about an hour before school got out, I went into the school office and I said, hey, I'm Nathaniel Holmes's mom and I want to pick him up from school. And they just looked at me and said, well, Nathaniel didn't go to class. And I said, what? I watched him go into school. And they said, well, he came to the office after first period and then he left. And that was the last time anybody saw from him. The school had no idea where he went or what he did. They just know he wasn't in class. So that's when I found out my son was gone. And I said, so my son walked in your school doors at 7:45 a.m. and he's gone. He's just gone. And I'm finding out at 2:30. And they didn't really have much of a response to me. I was visibly upset. I was angry. I was angry at the school. And so I left.
I really fault the school for a lot of things. They didn't inform me of anything. They didn't inform me that he had left the school. Had they done so, you know, I would have had maybe a 4-hour jump on where he would have been. He would have been in the area. And they said, well, our policy is, you know, we let the parents know that evening that their kid wasn't in school. And when I said that policy is problematic, they got on the defensive, and they wouldn't give me much other information.
I immediately called that number back of the phone that he used, and it was just a random lady walking her dog in the park. She said, yeah, he just asked to use the phone. And she even said, she goes, I knew he was lying to you, but I figured he was just going to go do something.
We started looking in places that he might have gone, to the downtown area, to other parks, and I just was not able to find him at all. And it was pretty immediately terrifying. Probably around 5, we contacted the police because he was a missing person at that point in my mind.
I'm Detective Troy Gordonier with the Westminster Police Department, and I'm the detective assigned to the Nathaniel Holmes missing persons case. So the police department did receive a call from Ben Holmes, who's the father of Nathaniel Holmes, on December 19th of 2017. An officer went to the house and gathered some information from him to try and figure out a possibility of locating Nathaniel. The officer took the initial report and learned that Nathaniel had gotten in trouble in the previous day or two because there was some marijuana that was found and also some prescription pills. So basically, his dad had grounded Nathaniel for a time. And Nathaniel went to school, and that's where he left the school after his first class and just didn't return home. And he didn't have his cell phone, so the information was kind of limited. Detectives contacted the school and was able to speak with the principal at the school, because the information we had was that the principal was probably the last person that actually talked to Nathaniel before Nathaniel went missing. That's when detectives learned that Nathaniel had told him that he was no longer going to be attending that school, that he was moving. The principal told him just go back to class, and Nathaniel didn't. Detectives followed up, and they found out from both parents that there was nobody moving anywhere. And what Nathaniel told the principal wasn't true.
That was really confusing to me because I don't know why he would say he was moving, and I don't know why I would not have gotten a phone call from the principal saying, hey, Nathaniel's in my office saying he's moving. He's obviously distressed, but we did not get a phone call from the principal.
So we believe that he had a plan, and he didn't tell anybody about his plan.
I was heartbroken. At this point, I was scared. I wanted to believe that it was going to be okay and he would just show up at his dad's house and that would be the end of it. But I was so afraid for him. Inside my body, I knew something was wrong. And I knew that we needed to find him. But I remember the night before he went missing, when I found the pills in his wallet. He had true fear in his voice when I had taken them. And he wasn't a scared kid. He was not afraid of anything. But I think he was scared of something or someone. And that's what led him to leave.
As soon as we realized that he wasn't at the school and he wasn't able to be found at the moment, I was very concerned immediately. He was never missing before.
My name is Hannah Holmes. I am Nathaniel's older sister.
My name is Seth, and I'm Nathaniel's younger brother.
In that moment, I didn't really know what to think.
It was very out of character for him. It just happened all of a sudden, and there was no word from him or anything. He just disappeared.
I immediately posted to Snapchat and Facebook, my little brother is missing. We don't know where he is. He doesn't have a phone. If anybody has seen him, call us, call the police.
My name is Jake Severson, and Nathaniel Holmes is my close friend. I met Nathaniel out of high school in 2016. There's nothing I wouldn't do for him, and I always consider him the little brother I never had. That's why I spent so much time with him. From my perspective, Nathaniel was sort of sheltered by his parents growing up. His dad was very strict and had very high expectations of him. And I wanted to teach him things about the world and teach him, almost street smarts. He's so book smart, but he hadn't had a lot of real world experiences, and that's what he had me there for. Summer of 2017, a lot of us, me included, started kind of doing drugs and things like that. A lot of us were doing cocaine quite frequently. It just became really popular in that friend group, and I think, in turn, might have influenced Nathaniel too. I think that he thinks, well, Jake and everybody else is doing it. I want to try it too. It really evolved quickly. It went from just doing it here and there to we were doing it every day. We were spending a lot of money on it. It was towards the end of the summer. I started trying to clean myself up quite a bit because I kind of came to the realization how bad off I was, and I was trying to help him also because I started to worry about him. He would break down crying, telling me he didn't know how to stop. He didn't know what to do. He had asked me for help. And I would tell him, there's no way for me to help because you gotta help yourself. And you gotta want to be done with that. One day he would be like that, and then the next day he would be very gung-ho. Let's keep doing drugs, why not? Who cares? What's the point in not doing them because life sucks anyway? The day before he went missing, he had called me in secret and asking me to get him more drugs. And he was crying and pleading with me. I said, Nathaniel, please just go to bed. We'll talk in the morning. There's not much we could do at 11 o'clock at night right now. And that was the last time I spoke to him. The next day, he went missing.
Looking back on it now, when he had gone to this new school, he was a little bit withdrawn. Maybe it was, beginnings of drug usage. I'm not certain.
I think during the time that Nathaniel struggled, he did not open up to me or his dad as much, but you don't have a lot of control when your child is 16, 17 years old. But I guess we thought if we could get him over this little bump that he was in life. He was so young, he still had so much ahead of him that, we were just trying to make our way. And I think that he probably told us things that we wanted to hear or wanted to believe. And I think there's probably some things that we missed.
My son had been missing for a day now. I did go to some of his friends' house. I knocked, I said, have you seen him? What's going on? Was he at school? Did he talk to you? Did he say anything? And his friends all said no. Nobody has been forthcoming with information. It's all been very close-lipped.
I remember I got a message from a friend who told me that Nathaniel was missing and he was just gone. And nobody had heard from him, and he was answering his phone. I remember a couple friends and I decided, all right, we're gonna go out and we're gonna look for him, because we didn't think that the police or his family would be able to get much information, because a lot of people were afraid of incriminating themselves or others. So they're not gonna give out a lot of information when it comes to somebody who's on drugs. They're gonna protect themselves. So I figured if anybody could find him, it'd probably be our friends and I. And I remember we went around everywhere. We went driving, looking everywhere for him, but he was just nowhere to be found, and he just vanished. And nobody knew a thing. Nobody knew what could have possibly happened.
One of my fears is that somehow he got into these drugs and ended up owing these people money, and he feels that he can't come back. He thinks that he's somehow keeping us from danger.
Our friend group was almost kind of like a safety net for him, where we protected him from how sometimes outside drug dealers can be, how those types of people can be. They can be very dangerous. And so he did lean on me and others to kind of keep him safe from those kind of people, because he didn't know how to deal with that. But as Nathaniel's addiction started to get more severe, I absolutely think he tried to find cocaine from other sources. I think he felt like he could go on his own and try to find it, and which may have led to him making worst decisions or meeting the wrong people.
I never, ever in a million years would think my son would leave on purpose, that he would leave because I just want to run away from home. There was nothing for him to run away from here. So something or someone scared him.
I feel like he may have ripped off somebody. He may have stolen from somebody, stolen money, drugs, and ran away to protect his family from those people. Those types of people, they go for your family. They go for your people that are closest to you. And I think that Nathaniel could have been trying to protect them.
Those first few weeks when Nathaniel was missing, my hope was that this is only going to be a couple more weeks. He'll be home by Christmas, and no, now he'll be home by the first of the year. After a few months of him being gone, it even became more concerning to me because it's like he disappeared off the face of the earth. He was just nowhere to be found.
I just kind of held on to hoping that maybe he would be in contact with me or somebody else to let somebody know that he was okay. And there was nothing for weeks and for months until one day I was at my house and there was a well-known drug dealer who lived in the same apartment complex as me. And I see Nathaniel go into her apartment. I remember I called his dad and I told his dad, I'm like, you know, we need to get the cops here. We need to get somebody here. Like, I swear I just saw Nathaniel here.
So in April of 2018, the Westminster Police Department received a tip that Nathaniel had been seen at an apartment on 60th Avenue. Detectives followed up with that and ended up speaking with a friend of Nathaniel's who said that Nathaniel had been hanging around this apartment complex, and this apartment possibly had drugs being used and sold out of the apartment. So detectives tried to follow up on that, and unfortunately, it didn't glean any information that Nathaniel, in fact, was at that specific apartment or had been around that complex. People the detectives spoke with said that they didn't know him and hadn't seen him around there. So that tip, unfortunately, didn't give us any more information.
He did have that friend, and he did say that he saw him. I'm not sure if he really believed that he did see him. He would know him if he did see him. But, you know, my question always is to the people who thought they saw him is why not stay with him and call 911? Nobody would do that. And that was probably the biggest frustration for me, but nothing ever became of it.
Nathaniel knew where I lived. There were 2 doors to get out of the apartment complex. There's a good chance he could have known that I was home and I could have saw him, and so he could have gone out the back door and exited a different way and gotten away a different route. I know it was nighttime, so there was a good chance he could have snuck away. There was also a good chance I could have not saw him at all. It could have been hope in my mind to see my friend, and so I don't know for sure if that was him or not.
We knew he would spend time with his friends around downtown Arvada, and there's a mix of people there, maybe some drug usage. There's a large transient population as well.
I felt in my heart as a mom that he was not far. I know my son is out there.
I'm Gregory Nieto. I've been a reporter with Channel 2 and Fox 31 for 23 years. Old Town Arvada has the water fountains, ice cream shops. Now you have a magnitude of breweries, a skate park. It's definitely a spot for adults and, of course, a lot of other teens to hang out. And like a lot of communities across the country, it's become kind of a haven, if you will, for homeless adults and homeless teens.
I know a lot of them, they like to hang out around the same parks a lot of us kids did. A lot of them were on drugs, along with the rest of us. I know whenever I was on drugs, I had some friends who were down there in that area who I would go to various houses and people's sheds, hanging out for hours with people, some people I haven't met before. So I think there was plenty of places for him to hide down there.
The atmosphere around the homeless community, especially for when you're dealing with kids or very young adults, it can be dangerous for them because they don't really know who they're hanging out with. There's drug use, there's people stealing from each other. It can be very dangerous for somebody who maybe hasn't been on the streets much. And with Nathaniel, the homeless community thing for him was probably fairly new and could present challenges of being assaulted or getting into other types of drugs, and also it could possibly even get into other criminal acts.
Some 1,000 to 2,000 people are homeless or living on the streets of just Arvada itself. So even if Nathaniel was in Arvada, it might be tough to find him.
We'd go through Old Town every single day. Every road we drove down, we always were looking for Nathaniel because we felt that he had to be close and he had to be somewhere in there.
But I didn't want to frighten Nathaniel away if he was hiding with the transient population. I bought a couple different cars so I could do stakeouts in certain areas and not be in the same car every day, and none of that came to anything. At other times, I would buy clothes at the thrift stores, and I would go in the homeless population, kind of dressed down, just seeing if anybody had known or seen him, just hoping somebody would give us some lead, but still no leads.
My mom and her friend and I, we made little care packages for homeless. We put his picture, our phone number, in with it. It had just some necessities maybe the homeless people would want. And I thought even if they grabbed the picture, just tossed it on the ground and took what was there, his picture was gonna blow somewhere. Somebody was gonna see it. Let's find him.
We drive by homeless shelters, camps, anywhere where like homeless are, trying to see if we find them or if anybody knew any information.
When your greatest hope is that your son is wandering around with the homeless people, that really says something about the situation you're in.
I was so afraid for him. I wondered if he was hungry. I wondered all those things that you wonder as a mother. It is the worst feeling you can have as a mother, to not know where your child is.
A page was made for him on Facebook, Bring Nathaniel Home, and there's thousands of people joined to this page trying to find him. And the posters were the same photo because I wanted to make sure when people saw this photo, they knew it was Nathaniel.
Because of his Facebook page, on January 11th of 2020, this woman with Safe Harbor Counseling in Weatherford, Texas, contacted us stating that there was a young man that had gone into her office and was selling bread. He was very cordial, he was very nice. Later that night, she was at home and she was going through Facebook and she saw a missing person flyer on Facebook that was Nathaniel. She looking at the photo from the Facebook flyer, and based upon who she saw in her office, she thought it possibly could have been Nathaniel. So when she went back to work, she looked through video footage at the office. She was able to get some still photos of this young man and sent those to detectives here in Westminster.
When I received that tip, I thought it was the most credible one that we've had, and I thought, could this be him? Could this be the day we find him?
Nathaniel Holmes was last seen December 19th, 2017. If you have any information, please contact the Westminster Police Department at 303-658-4360.
Safe Harbor Counseling said that it's not unusual for members of some of the local churches around there who are helping people that have an addiction or suffer from some homelessness, that the churches will send those people out to sell bread so that they can help make some money. But looking at the photos that were provided, it was hard to say if that was Nathaniel or not. And so a positive identification couldn't have been made. But detectives followed up with some of the churches that are in that Weatherford, Texas area, but they did not recognize Nathaniel as being associated with them.
He did have an uncle in Texas, and he was sort of familiar with that whole area. I did see that picture, but I do not think it was him. I don't think it looked like him, enough like him. He hadn't been gone that long. and you would know your child, and I don't think it looked enough like him. There's probably some resemblance, just like the people who I stop on the street. You know, it's enough to where you say, hey, that could be him, but I did not think it looked like him, no.
By the time Nathaniel's 18th birthday rolled around, he had almost been missing for 1 year. I never would have thought I would be celebrating his birthday without him. We all got together at my mom's house. We made his favorite dinner, and we got all of our presents for him and put them in the middle, and it was really hard. It's still hard celebrating without him. It just doesn't feel right.
And Mom would still get him cake and presents, everything. It's very hard doing that when he's not there.
We really never thought he would be missing his 18th birthday. Trying to wrap your head around everything that is happening, along with having your other children have to live their lives also, it's hard.
The longer time goes on, and the information that we have isn't fresh information, it does start to become a problem when you're trying to locate somebody. You don't have anybody else that you can try and follow up with. The longer somebody is gone, it becomes quite the challenge to try and find them. And they could be anywhere.
When we first reported on the story, there was still that sense of him as a child. But with the passage of time, you're not only considered an adult, but subliminally, I think, law enforcement looks at someone who's 18 as an adult and maybe has now the free will to do as they please.
At that point, I felt like he was still hiding. I had the thought to myself, and I mentioned to other people that, well, Nathaniel's 18. And with that, Nathaniel knows he's not stupid. He knows when he's 18, he can make his own decisions. He can leave his house if he pleases, and it can be on his own.
At this point, I was very hopeful that we would come across Nathaniel just being with a transient population or hanging out with some of his friends and somewhat embarrassed about having been caught. I got in the car with my younger son. We drove around downtown. We drove around in Pueblo and in other states in nearby areas, New Mexico and Utah and Wyoming, anywhere that I would think that a transient population would gather. It's amazing how many homeless places there were, the little enclaves behind stores on the side of highways. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. So when I received the tip via Facebook from a truck driver that said they had seen somebody that was asking how to get to California, I was immediately interested in this. On the morning of Saturday, 2021, by a truck stop in Gallup, New Mexico, an individual who was either on drugs or having a mental breakdown, not sure which, but he was at least composed enough to ask me how long it would take to get to California. Figured he was hitchhiking to California by truck, so I told him at least 10 hours. Seeing his hands were shaking and breathing heavily, I told him he should probably go home and find a safe place to stay and wait out his drugs instead of the area he was in that was sketchy. It seemed to really upset him. He snapped, I got to get away from Colorado. I asked what he was wanted for, and he said he was being searched for by people in Colorado. I asked if it was okay for him to give me his name, and he just said, Nate Holmes. This truck driver in New Mexico went on to say that this man walked off, but she said that she did some Googling and found Nathaniel Holmes missing poster from Westminster, Colorado. She said, I saw his photo and I can't tell it was him for sure. Longer hair and facial hair. Also nighttime, so hard to see. Wearing baggy black clothes and guessing been homeless or something for a while. Looked rough. It's also important, it's about 500 miles from Denver to Gallup, New Mexico. While this may sound like a lot to the ordinary person, truck drivers and trains can do 1,000 easy in a day.
It did seem weird that he said Nate. Now, I think maybe his friends might call him Nate. We as a family, I have never called him anything but Nathaniel. But if, my thinking was maybe he's changed his name to Nate, but I don't know. So that seemed a little bit weird, but it's always something you have to follow up.
So immediately upon getting that tip, we contacted the Gallup Police Department, and they went to search the area within hours of the tip coming in, but it unfortunately was 6 or 7 hours after the encounter that the tip came through Facebook. But we sent the police looking around the area. They looked at videos, but nothing came of it.
When we got that tip, and it really did seem viable, but then that hope is dashed, and it's almost like you feel like the day he left all over again.
It's this great disappointment after every lead comes to nothing. It is soul-crushing. It's absolutely soul-crushing.
At this point, we were not getting very many leads, and as a mother, you will do anything to try and find your child. I've never really reached out to psychics or spiritual guides before, but I was trying to reach at straws. And there was one person in particular that sat with me, and she talked about seeing Nathaniel's light. She said that his light was dimming some and that he was not in a safe place, but he was alive. She had pulled out a map, and she looked at the map, and she had said, I see him in California. And in September 2021, about 3.5 years after Nathaniel had been missing, we got a tip that somebody had spoke with him in a park in Oceanside, California. This person in Oceanside said that a man walked up to her and asked to borrow her phone. She said that he didn't use the phone, he just Googled the name Nathaniel Holmes.
And then he handed the phone back to her and walked off. And she said, it looked like it might have been him, but couldn't tell.
Knowing Nathaniel was always on Facebook, and I think the first place he would check if he was interested maybe would be to see what people were saying about him, or if anybody had any leads or anything like that. He may have been interested and trying to find out more information.
Ben called me and said, I don't know. And I said, we got to go with your gut.
Thought it was credible, and 16 hours later, I was in Oceanside, California.
We had no idea anything about California or how big Oceanside was. Well, by the time he got there, I think the lady who had originally messaged him kind of ghosted him again.
I tried to give missing person posters to the police, but they sort of scoffed at that and said there are thousands of missing people wandering around here. We have thousands of transients, and they didn't seem very forthcoming in trying to help. So it came to nothing.
At any given time, there are more than 150,000 homeless people in the state of California. When you talk about the number of homeless encampments there in the state as well, it would simply be impossible for at least one individual to fly out there and search for their son.
The worry and the dread just continues to get worse. And I feel like we tried everything. Trying to live a normal life with a child missing is impossible.
We held the candlelight vigil on the 5-year anniversary of his disappearance. We sent up a little Chinese balloon with different sayings and writings and prayers to come home. And it definitely heartened me to know that the community is still behind us and still very hopeful.
I think as time goes on, it gets harder because now we're at 5.5 years. Nathaniel's 22 years old, and still nothing, still no sign of him, still nothing. It's a cold case.
If you've seen or heard of anything about my son Nathaniel, please just let us know. You can contact the Westminster Police Department. They're very thorough and they're very good at their job.
If I could talk to Nathaniel, I just want him to know that I would give anything for him to come home and to show him how far I've come and to bring him up to that level with me and for him to live the wonderful life I know that he was meant to live.
Nathaniel, we all really love and miss you, and I really need you back.
November 27, 1995. The rain had already begun long before the daylight surrendered to evening. It wasn't the kind of storm that announced itself with thunder or violent winds. It was quieter than that. A steady curtain of cold English rain drifted over the Surrey countryside, blurring distant hills into ghostly silhouettes and coating every narrow road with a dull silver sheen. Cars moved more slowly than usual. Bare branches swayed almost lazily against a sky that looked as though someone had drained every trace of color from it. Somewhere in those grey hills, a 16-year-old girl stepped out of a taxi. The driver watched her through his mirror for only a few seconds. She paid the fare politely. She thanked him. Then she closed the door. Nothing about those final words sounded unusual. Nothing about her face suggested panic. She wasn't running. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for help. She simply stood there, alone beside a quiet country road, while the rain soaked into her dark coat. The driver hesitated. Years later, he would still remember that hesitation. Passengers usually walked away almost immediately. They hurried toward houses, shops, train stations, anywhere that offered warmth from the relentless November rain. But this girl did something different. She remained still. Not frozen by fear. Not confused. Waiting. She seemed to be looking toward the trees, then down the empty road, almost as though she expected someone to appear at any moment. Or perhaps she was gathering enough courage to take one final step. The taxi disappeared around a bend. When the driver glanced into his rearview mirror one last time, she was still standing exactly where he had left her. It was the last confirmed sighting of Ruth Wilson. She has never been seen again. Almost 3 decades have passed since that rainy afternoon, and the mystery has only deepened with time. No body. No confirmed suspect. No confession. No evidence capable of telling investigators whether they were searching for a missing teenager, the victim of a hidden crime, or a young woman who had chosen to erase herself from the world forever. Cases like this leave behind more than unanswered questions. They leave empty chairs at dinner tables. Birthdays that quietly pass without celebration. Christmas presents that are never opened. Bedrooms preserved almost exactly as they were, because changing anything feels too much like admitting someone is never coming home. For families, uncertainty can become a sentence without an ending. Grief usually follows a cruel but understandable path. Someone dies. The truth arrives. The mourning begins. But uncertainty refuses to grant even that small mercy. Every telephone call becomes a possibility. Every knock at the door steals a heartbeat. Every face passing through a crowded street demands another glance. Hope becomes impossible to abandon. Yet impossible to trust. The years stretch forward while time inside the family remains strangely frozen. Some missing person cases eventually reveal horrifying truths. Others end with miraculous reunions. A handful simply refuse to end at all. Ruth Wilson belongs to that final category. Even today, investigators continue to keep her file open. Because despite decades of speculation, no single theory has ever managed to explain every strange detail surrounding the last day anyone saw her alive. If Ruth intended to disappear voluntarily, why leave behind clues that almost beg to be discovered? If she intended to end her own life, Where was her body after one of the largest searches the area had ever seen? If someone else met her that afternoon, who were they? And why has no one ever come forward? The questions multiply far faster than the answers. That is what makes this story so unsettling. Every clue seems to point in one direction. Then another clue quietly points somewhere else. Each possibility opens another door while closing none of the others. Imagine standing before a 1,000-piece puzzle. Every piece appears genuine. Every edge fits somewhere. Yet no matter how patiently you work, the picture never comes together. That is exactly what detectives faced. That is exactly what Ruth's family still faces. Because this mystery did not begin on the lonely road where the taxi stopped. It began weeks earlier. Perhaps years earlier. Perhaps inside a quiet family home where one devastating secret had remained buried for more than a decade. Some mysteries begin with violence. Others begin with silence. Silence inside conversations. Silence inside families. Silence surrounding truths that adults believe children should never hear. Sometimes those silences protect. Sometimes they destroy. For 16 years, Ruth believed she understood one of the saddest moments in her family's history. Her mother had died in an accident. That was the story. Simple. Painful. Final. A terrible fall down the stairs. The kind of tragedy people whisper about before awkwardly changing the subject. It was a story that allowed life to continue. Friends accepted it. Neighbors accepted it. Most importantly, Ruth accepted it. Children rarely question the stories adults build around them. Especially stories wrapped in grief. Especially stories told by people they trust. Then, everything changed. Somewhere among ordinary documents and forgotten papers, Ruth discovered something she had never expected to find. Her mother's death certificate. A single piece of paper. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. No hidden diary. No mysterious letter. Just an official document. Cold. Clinical. Unemotional. Yet those few printed words carried enough weight to fracture the reality Ruth had lived inside for nearly her entire life. Her mother had not died after falling down the stairs. Her mother had taken her own life. The difference between those two versions of the past cannot easily be measured. One is a tragic accident. The other carries questions that echo across generations. Why? What happened? Was she suffering? Could someone have helped? Did anyone know? For a 16-year-old girl still trying to understand her own identity, learning that the foundation of her childhood had been built upon a lie must have felt like discovering the ground beneath her feet was never solid at all. Friends would later describe Ruth as deeply shaken. Not only because of how her mother had died, but because she realized the people closest to her had hidden that truth from her. Trust is a fragile thing. Once broken, every memory begins changing shape. Conversations are replayed inside the mind. Old photographs suddenly feel different. Expressions once overlooked acquire new meaning. Questions emerge that can never be answered. Had everyone known except her? Why hadn't anyone told her? Was she too young? Or had nobody believed she deserved the truth? Secrets rarely remain isolated. Once uncovered, they spread into every corner of memory. Perhaps Ruth found herself wondering what else she had never been told. Perhaps she questioned relationships she had never doubted before. Perhaps she searched for explanations that simply did not exist. No one can truly know what occupied her thoughts during those final weeks. But those who cared about her noticed changes. Not dramatic transformations. Not the obvious warning signs that only seem clear in hindsight. Instead, subtle shifts. Moments when she appeared quieter than usual. More reflective. More distant. The kind of changes that often disappear beneath the ordinary rhythm of everyday life. Teenagers have difficult weeks. They become withdrawn. They spend longer alone. Parents assume moods will pass. Friends assume someone else knows what's wrong. Life continues. Until one ordinary day suddenly becomes the day everything changes forever. Looking back now, investigators have examined every conversation Ruth had during those final weeks. Every class she attended. Every person who remembered speaking with her. Every receipt. Every bus route. Every minute that could somehow explain what happened after the taxi drove away. Yet despite decades of investigation, no timeline has managed to answer the most important question. What was Ruth expecting to find at Box Hill? It is a beautiful place. Rolling hills. Ancient woodland. Walking trails that attract families, hikers, cyclists, and photographers throughout the year. On sunny afternoons, children laugh there. Dogs race through open fields. Couples sit on grassy slopes overlooking the Surrey countryside. But beauty changes after dark. Rain transforms familiar paths into unfamiliar places. The trees seem taller. The silence becomes heavier. Footsteps disappear beneath wet leaves. Mist settles between branches until distances become impossible to judge. It is entirely possible for someone to feel utterly alone there, even when civilization lies only a short drive away. That afternoon, Box Hill wore none of its usual charm. The rain swallowed color. The clouds pressed low across the landscape. The winding roads carried very little traffic. It was the sort of afternoon when most people preferred staying indoors beside warm fires and steaming cups of tea. Yet Ruth chose to come here. Not by accident. Not because she was lost. She gave the taxi driver a destination. She knew where she wanted to go. That single decision has haunted investigators ever since. Because people rarely travel deliberately to isolated places without a reason. The challenge has always been discovering what that reason was. Was she meeting someone she trusted? Someone she feared? Someone she believed could answer questions about her mother's death? Or had she chosen the location for reasons known only to herself? Every possibility remains open. Every possibility carries its own heartbreaking implications. The deeper investigators looked into Ruth's final days, the stranger the story became. What first appeared to be the disappearance of an ordinary schoolgirl slowly unfolded into a mystery filled with quiet contradictions, carefully timed decisions, and small details that refused to fit together. None of those details seemed remarkable on their own. Together, they formed a pattern that no one has ever been able to explain. And it all began with what should have been an entirely ordinary Monday morning. The morning arrived without urgency. Across the small village of Betchworth, the day began the way countless late autumn mornings always had. Curtains were drawn back to reveal another sky the color of wet concrete. Chimneys released thin streams of smoke that dissolved almost immediately into the damp air. Commuters climbed into their cars with collars turned against the cold. Schoolchildren hurried along narrow pavements with backpacks bouncing against heavy winter coats, their conversations carried away by the wind before anyone could hear them clearly. Nothing about that Monday suggested history was about to remember it. Nothing hinted that before sunset, an entire community would begin asking the same impossible question. Where was Ruth Wilson? At 16, Ruth existed in the uncertain space between childhood and adulthood, an age when every emotion seemed larger than life and every unanswered question demanded an answer. Friends remembered a thoughtful girl, intelligent without trying to prove it, reserved but not unfriendly. She was not the loudest person in the room. She rarely fought for attention. Instead, she observed. She listened. She noticed details that other people often overlooked. People like Ruth are sometimes difficult to understand from the outside. They can spend an afternoon laughing with friends while carrying worries they never mention aloud. They can appear perfectly composed while quietly unraveling inside. To strangers, nothing seems unusual. To those closest to them, the changes are often so gradual that they blend into everyday life. Looking back after a tragedy, everyone searches their memories for warning signs. A different expression. An unfinished sentence. A moment that felt insignificant at the time but later refuses to leave the mind. Human memory is cruel in that way. It edits itself after disaster. What once seemed ordinary begins to glow with unbearable importance. Every smile is questioned. Every goodbye sounds different. Every decision becomes part of a puzzle that nobody realized they were assembling. On that Monday, Ruth did not go to school. There was no dramatic announcement. No emotional confrontation. She simply did not attend. Instead, she set out alone, carrying with her whatever thoughts had occupied her mind during those previous weeks. No one walking past her could have guessed they were watching someone who would soon become the center of one of Britain's most enduring missing person cases. She blended effortlessly into the rhythm of an ordinary day. That, perhaps, is one of the most unsettling truths about disappearances. They almost always begin inside ordinary moments. Not with flashing lights. Not with screams. Not with violence witnessed by dozens of people. They begin with routine. A familiar road. A familiar bus stop. A familiar conversation. The ordinary becomes extraordinary only after someone fails to come home. One of Ruth's first known stops that day was a florist. The visit itself seemed almost impossible to interpret. She ordered flowers. Not for a birthday. Not for a celebration. Not because someone had fallen ill. The bouquet was intended for her stepmother. More unusual still, she requested that the flowers be delivered 2 days later. Wednesday. Not that afternoon. Not immediately. Later. The request appeared simple enough that no one inside the shop had reason to question it. Customers ordered flowers every day. Deliveries were scheduled according to convenience. Nothing about the exchange demanded attention. Only after Ruth disappeared did that quiet transaction become something investigators returned to again and again. Why wait 2 days? If she expected to be home, the delayed delivery made sense. If she expected never to return, the timing became something else entirely. A final gesture. A goodbye that would arrive only after she was gone. Yet even that interpretation raises uncomfortable questions. Why send flowers without leaving a message? Flowers often speak where words fail. They express gratitude, forgiveness, love, regret, sympathy. Without a note, however, the bouquet became strangely silent. Its meaning remained trapped inside Ruth's mind. The florist could remember the order, the date, the request, but not the answer everyone desperately wanted. What had Ruth been thinking? Investigators would eventually discover that nearly every action she took that day carried this same unsettling quality. Nothing was overtly suspicious. Nothing clearly pointed toward a single explanation. Each event could be interpreted in multiple ways. Every clue seemed to argue with the next. From the florist, Ruth continued to Dorking. The market town, nestled among the rolling Surrey hills, moved through another ordinary weekday. Shopkeepers arranged displays in their windows. Buses arrived and departed on schedule. Elderly couples wandered between bakeries and bookstores. Teenagers hurried through the town center without paying attention to anyone around them. Somewhere within that everyday flow of life walked Ruth. Invisible. Not because people literally failed to see her, but because she gave them no reason to remember her. Disappearances often reveal an uncomfortable reality. We pass hundreds of strangers every week. Most vanish from memory within seconds. We remember only those who surprise us. The man singing loudly on a street corner. The child chasing pigeons across a square. The woman carrying an enormous bouquet of balloons. An ordinary teenage girl wearing a raincoat attracts no attention at all. Ruth entered the local library. Libraries possess a unique kind of silence. Not an empty silence. A living one. Pages turning. Pens scratching against paper. The faint hum of fluorescent lights. Quiet footsteps disappearing between shelves lined with thousands of stories. It is a place where people search for information, escape, or simply somewhere peaceful to spend an afternoon. Ruth remained there for several hours. No one knows exactly what occupied her during that time. There are no surviving conversations capable of revealing her thoughts. No diary entries explaining her intentions. Only fragments. Only time. Several hours that have since become one of the great blank spaces in the investigation. It is tempting to imagine what may have passed through her mind. But imagination is not evidence. Investigators were forced to separate what they could prove from what they merely suspected. That distinction would define the entire case. Because evidence tells stories very differently from speculation. Evidence is stubborn. Evidence refuses to comfort. Evidence often remains incomplete. The truth, meanwhile, waits patiently behind it. When Ruth eventually left the library, the afternoon had already begun slipping toward evening. The rain had not stopped. If anything, the weather had grown colder. November daylight in England disappears quickly, especially beneath thick clouds. Shadows lengthened across the streets long before sunset. Streetlights prepared to replace a sun few people had seen all day. Somewhere between the library and the taxi rank, Ruth made choices that no one can fully reconstruct. Did she hesitate? Did she consider turning back? Did she reread something inside her bag? Did she look over her shoulder, expecting someone? Those moments are lost forever. Investigators could rebuild routes. They could interview witnesses. They could collect receipts and estimate times. But they could never recover private thoughts. Eventually, Ruth hailed a taxi. It was a decision that would become one of the most carefully examined moments in the investigation. Taxi drivers often become accidental witnesses to history. They transport people during celebrations, arguments, first dates, funerals, hospital emergencies, and ordinary commutes without ever realizing they are participating in someone's most significant day. This journey would later be replayed countless times. The driver remembered Ruth as calm. She was polite. Soft-spoken. Nothing about her behavior suggested immediate distress. There was no visible panic. No urgent requests. No obvious fear of being followed. She simply asked to be taken to Box Hill. For local people, Box Hill was hardly an unknown destination. It attracted walkers throughout the year and offered spectacular views across the Surrey countryside. But on a wet Monday afternoon in late November, it was an unusual choice. Not impossible. Not suspicious in itself. Just unusual. The driver accepted the fare without giving it much thought. During the journey, conversation remained limited. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. The windscreen wipers swept back and forth with mechanical precision, briefly clearing the driver's view before fresh droplets reclaimed the glass. Outside, hedgerows blurred together. Bare trees reached upward like dark fingers against the fading sky. The countryside looked peaceful. Almost too peaceful. There is something deceptive about quiet landscapes. They invite confidence. They appear harmless. Yet isolation has always been one of nature's defining characteristics. A person can disappear far more easily where there are few witnesses than where crowds gather. As the taxi climbed toward Box Hill, houses became less frequent. Roads narrowed. The surrounding woodland grew denser. Traffic thinned until long stretches of road appeared almost deserted. The driver followed Ruth's instructions carefully. She knew where she wanted him to stop. That detail would later become critically important. She was not asking to be dropped at a visitor center. Not near a busy cafe. Not at a familiar tourist entrance. Instead, she requested a quieter location near one of the more secluded paths. Whether she had visited before remains uncertain. Whether someone had instructed her to meet them there has never been established. Yet the precision of her directions suggested purpose. She wasn't wandering. She wasn't exploring. She had somewhere specific in mind. The taxi slowed. Gravel crackled beneath the tires. Rain continued falling in thin, relentless sheets. The surrounding woodland seemed almost motionless. The engine idled. The meter stopped. The journey had ended. Neither the driver nor Ruth could possibly have known that every second from that point onward would be analyzed for decades. Every remembered glance. Every spoken word. Every pause before she reached for the door. History often hides inside moments that appear completely ordinary until they become the last moments anyone can remember. Ruth reached into her pocket, counted out the fare with steady hands, and passed the money forward without hesitation. There was no visible rush in her movements, no trembling fingers, no frantic search for loose change. She thanked the driver with the quiet politeness that people later described as entirely consistent with her character. It was an exchange so ordinary that, under any other circumstances, it would have disappeared into memory within minutes. Instead, it became one of the most important conversations in the entire investigation. The driver watched as she stepped onto the damp roadside. The door shut with a muted thud before the sound was swallowed by the rain. Cold air rushed briefly into the taxi, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and soaked woodland. Ruth pulled her coat a little closer around herself, but she did not immediately begin walking. She stood still. Not for a second. Not even for two. Long enough for it to feel unusual. Drivers notice habits. Years behind the wheel teach them to recognize patterns without consciously trying. Business travelers hurry toward meetings. Families gather children before crossing roads. Hikers shoulder backpacks and set off toward trails almost immediately. Even tourists pause only long enough to orient themselves before moving on. Ruth did none of those things. She remained exactly where she was. The driver later struggled to explain why that image stayed with him for so many years. Perhaps it was because she appeared to be expecting someone. Perhaps it was because she kept looking toward the road rather than toward the wooded path nearby. Or perhaps it was simply the instinctive feeling that something about the moment did not fit. Human intuition is difficult to measure. Sometimes it proves remarkably accurate. Sometimes it invents meaning where none exists. After tragedies, memories become colored by knowledge that did not exist at the time. The driver himself admitted that he thought little of it until Ruth's face appeared in newspapers. Only then did the smallest details begin resurfacing with startling clarity. The rain continued to fall. He shifted the taxi into gear. The vehicle rolled forward. For a brief moment, he glanced into the rearview mirror. She was still there. A solitary figure standing against a backdrop of dark trees beneath an overcast November sky. Then the bend in the road swallowed the scene. Whatever happened after that unfolded beyond the eyes of every confirmed witness. From that point onward, the story enters a landscape of silence. No verified sightings. No reliable timeline. No certainty. Only possibilities. Somewhere beyond that curve in the road, Ruth Wilson vanished. Not gradually. Not over several days. Almost instantaneously. It is astonishing how quickly certainty can dissolve. One moment, a person's existence is anchored by witnesses, receipts, conversations, and familiar routines. The next, they become known only through absence. An empty seat in a classroom. An unanswered telephone. A bedroom waiting in quiet expectation. The transition is so abrupt that families often spend the first hours refusing to believe anything is truly wrong. Surely she had missed the bus. Surely she was staying with a friend. Surely there was an explanation so ordinary it would soon feel embarrassing to have worried at all. Hope often begins as denial. It is one of the mind's gentlest defenses. But evening has a way of stripping away comforting assumptions. As daylight disappeared over Surrey, concern slowly hardened into fear. Each passing hour without contact transformed ordinary delay into something much more frightening. By the time Ruth failed to return home, questions were beginning to outnumber answers. Where had she gone after leaving the taxi? Had she met someone? Had she wandered into the woods? Had she chosen to disappear? Or had someone else made that choice for her? The first hours after a disappearance are often the most critical. Investigators know this. Families rarely do. To parents, time becomes distorted. Minutes stretch into hours. Every sound outside the house suggests the possibility of footsteps approaching the front door. Every ringing telephone interrupts silence with equal measures of hope and dread. Inside the Wilson household, the ordinary rhythm of family life had already begun to fracture. Dinner could wait. Homework no longer mattered. Television programs continued playing in the background, but no one truly watched them. The only thing that mattered was finding Ruth. Yet somewhere beyond the village, the countryside remained indifferent. Rain continued washing over narrow roads. Woodland trails disappeared beneath darkness. The same wind that rattled windows in nearby homes moved silently through the trees of Box Hill, erasing footprints, carrying away sounds, leaving behind only the relentless passage of time. Nature keeps no records. It offers no testimony. If something happened there that afternoon, the landscape revealed nothing. That silence would become one of the greatest enemies of the investigation. Over the years, countless detectives, journalists, psychologists, and armchair investigators would attempt to reconstruct those missing moments. Maps would be unfolded across conference tables. Timelines would be drawn and redrawn. Witness statements would be compared until individual sentences were practically memorized. Still, the crucial gap remained untouched. Between the moment the taxi disappeared around the corner, and everything that followed. It is within that invisible space that every theory about Ruth Wilson lives. Some believe she walked willingly toward someone she trusted. Others imagine her disappearing alone among the trees, carrying emotional burdens too heavy for anyone around her to fully understand. Still others argue that coincidence placed her in the path of someone whose intentions she could never have anticipated. Each theory explains certain facts. Each theory fails to explain others. That is the curse of this case. No explanation is complete. Every answer creates another question. If she intended never to return home, why leave behind gestures that seemed designed to comfort the people she loved? If she planned to meet someone, why has that person's identity never emerged despite decades of investigation? If she became the victim of a crime, how could so little physical evidence remain after such an extensive search? These questions have echoed for nearly 30 years. Time changes almost everything. Roads are widened. Buildings disappear. Children become parents. Parents become grandparents. Witnesses grow older. Memories soften around the edges. But mysteries like this resist the passage of time. They remain suspended, forever waiting for the one missing piece capable of transforming speculation into truth. Perhaps that is why Ruth's story continues to fascinate people decades later. Not because it offers shocking violence. Not because it delivers dramatic courtroom confrontations. But because it denies the one thing every human mind instinctively seeks: closure. There is something deeply unsettling about unfinished stories. We are taught from childhood that every mystery eventually receives an answer. Books end. Films conclude. Detectives solve crimes. Questions are resolved before the credits roll. Reality owes us no such comfort. Sometimes a young girl steps out of a taxi on a rainy afternoon. And the world never learns where she went. That absence has become louder than any explanation ever could. Yet before investigators searched forests, before helicopters circled above the Surrey Hills, before newspaper headlines transformed Ruth Wilson into a name recognized across Britain, there was simply a family trying to understand why their daughter had not come home. They had no idea that the following days would alter the course of their lives forever. They had no way of knowing that every conversation they had shared with Ruth would soon be replayed endlessly inside their own minds. Every disagreement. Every smile. Every ordinary morning. Every goodbye. All of them would suddenly seem precious. All of them would become evidence. Because once someone disappears, the past is no longer just memory. It becomes the only place left to search. And for Ruth Wilson, that search would begin not in the lonely woods of Box Hill, but inside the quiet walls of a family home where love, grief, unanswered questions, and one devastating secret had been intertwined for years without anyone realizing just how fragile that fragile balance truly was. To understand why investigators would later examine every decision Ruth made during her final weeks, it is necessary to go back even further, to understand the life she had lived before the rain, before the taxi, before Box Hill became forever linked to her name. And before one ordinary Monday transformed into one of Britain's most haunting unsolved disappearances. The Wilson family home stood in the quiet village of Betchworth, tucked into the rolling landscape of Surrey where life moved at a pace that seemed almost untouched by the outside world. Narrow country lanes curved between hedgerows that had existed longer than anyone could remember. Stone cottages leaned gently with age. Church bells marked the passing of hours more faithfully than clocks, and familiar faces greeted one another in village shops with the effortless warmth that comes from years of shared routines. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed almost immediately. Children walked to school along the same pavements every morning. Neighbors knew whose dog had escaped before the owners themselves did. The postman rarely needed to check house numbers because he already knew every family by name. From the outside, Betchworth appeared almost timeless. Safe. Predictable. Comforting. It was exactly the sort of place people imagined when they thought about raising children far from the noise and uncertainty of the city. For Ruth Wilson, however, this peaceful village contained memories that were far more complicated than anyone looking in from the outside could have imagined. Every family carries stories that visitors never see. Photographs arranged neatly on shelves reveal smiling faces but never explain what happened before or after the shutter clicked. Dinner tables can appear perfectly ordinary while invisible tensions pass silently between the people sitting around them. A home can be filled with love and still contain grief that refuses to loosen its grip. The Wilson household was no exception. Years before Ruth became one of Britain's most enduring missing persons, tragedy had already visited the family. When Ruth was only 3 years old, her mother, Nesta Wilson, died. At that age, children understand absence long before they understand death. They notice empty chairs, missing bedtime stories, voices that no longer echo through hallways. But permanence is a concept far beyond their reach. A 3-year-old cannot comprehend why someone who once kissed them goodnight will never walk through the front door again. Adults, hoping to protect children from unbearable truths, often simplify reality. Sometimes those simplified stories become permanent. That is exactly what happened here. As Ruth grew older, she was told that her mother had died after falling down the stairs. It was undeniably tragic, but it was also a version of events that adults believed a child could carry without being crushed by it. An accident feels random. Cruel, perhaps. But understandable. There is no lingering question of choice. No impossible search for reasons. No fear that the person who died had wanted to leave the people they loved. For years, Ruth accepted that explanation without challenge. Why wouldn't she? Children build their understanding of the world from the words of the adults around them. Parents become the first historians of a child's life. When they describe the past, those memories become foundations upon which identity is built. Ruth's understanding of her family rested upon that foundation. Her mother had been taken by an accident. It was a sorrow shared by the family, but it belonged to history. Life had continued. Her father eventually remarried. A new family structure slowly emerged. Ruth lived with her father, her stepmother, and her younger half-sister. Like countless blended families, there's undoubtedly experienced ordinary disagreements, moments of affection, awkward adjustments, and everyday routines that rarely seemed remarkable while they were happening. Breakfast before school. Homework spread across the dining table. Arguments over untidy bedrooms. Weekend errands. Television playing softly during the evening. Nothing about those moments suggested that one day investigators would attempt to reconstruct them with forensic precision. The ordinary rarely attracts attention until it becomes impossible to revisit. Friends who knew Ruth often described her as intelligent, mature for her age, and thoughtful. She was not someone who constantly sought the spotlight. She seemed more comfortable observing conversations than dominating them. Teachers reportedly regarded her as capable. Classmates remembered someone who could be kind without demanding recognition for it. There was no reputation for reckless behavior. No history that immediately placed her among teenagers constantly attracting concern from adults. Like many 16-year-olds, Ruth occupied that complicated stage of life where independence begins growing faster than confidence. Teenagers spend enormous amounts of energy trying to answer questions they can barely articulate. Who am I? Where do I belong? What kind of person will I become? Those questions are challenging even under the most stable circumstances. When grief and hidden family history become part of the equation, they grow heavier still. Adolescence has a curious way of reopening childhood wounds. Losses that seemed distant suddenly demand new understanding. A child who accepted a parent's death at age 5 may begin questioning every detail by age 15. Curiosity deepens. Emotional understanding expands. Simple explanations that once satisfied become insufficient. Many teenagers begin asking difficult questions about parents they barely remember. What were they like? Did they laugh loudly? What music did they enjoy? What dreams did they have before becoming parents? Would they have been proud of the person I am becoming? These questions are not signs of unhappiness. They are part of building identity. To understand ourselves, we naturally seek to understand those who came before us. For Ruth, those questions increasingly centered around the mother she had lost almost before she could remember her. Memories from early childhood are often fragmented. A scent. A smile. A vague image of someone kneeling to tie a shoelace. The human mind fills missing pieces with stories told by relatives, photographs tucked into albums, and tiny moments repeated often enough that they begin feeling like personal memories. Perhaps Ruth wondered whether her own memories truly belonged to her, or whether they had been borrowed from everyone else's recollections. No one can know. What investigators do know is that, during the weeks before her disappearance, something fundamentally altered Ruth's understanding of her family's past. It did not happen because someone finally sat her down for a difficult conversation. There was no carefully planned confession. Instead, truth arrived unexpectedly. Almost accidentally. Somewhere among family documents, Ruth discovered her mother's death certificate. Official documents possess a strange authority. Unlike stories passed between family members, they are not softened by emotion. They do not protect feelings. They record facts with cold precision. Names. Dates. Causes of death. Nothing more. Nothing less. The words on that certificate contradicted everything Ruth believed she knew. Her mother had not died in an accidental fall. She had died by suicide. The revelation was devastating not simply because of the cause of death itself. It shattered the trust Ruth had placed in the narrative that had shaped her childhood. In a single moment, the story she had carried for more than a decade collapsed. Every conversation about her mother suddenly acquired a second meaning. Every omission became visible. Every comforting explanation now appeared incomplete. Imagine discovering that one of the defining events of your life had been fundamentally different from what you had believed for 13 years. The emotional impact extends far beyond surprise. It forces every memory into question. Why had no one told the truth? Who decided she should never know? At what age had they intended to tell her? Or had they hoped she would never discover it at all? These questions rarely arrive one at a time. They come all at once, colliding inside the mind until certainty itself becomes difficult to recognize. Friends would later recall that Ruth appeared deeply affected after learning the truth. That reaction is hardly surprising. Suicide leaves behind a different kind of grief than accidental death. It often burdens surviving family members with emotions that are extraordinarily difficult to untangle. Sadness becomes mixed with confusion. Love becomes intertwined with guilt. People search endlessly for explanations that may never exist. For a 16-year-old girl already navigating the emotional complexity of adolescence, the discovery could only have intensified questions she had scarcely begun asking herself. Yet there is another dimension to the revelation that investigators have considered for decades. It was not merely the knowledge that changed Ruth. It was the realization that those closest to her had hidden it. Trust between parents and children is built less upon perfection than honesty. Children generally forgive mistakes. They struggle far more with deception. Even when adults believe they are acting out of protection, the discovery of a long-kept secret can feel like betrayal. Whether Ruth viewed it that way remains impossible to know with certainty. She left no diary explaining her emotions. No recorded interview. No written confession of her thoughts. All investigators possess are observations from those around her. Friends noticed changes. Teachers may have sensed she was quieter. Family members undoubtedly carried memories of conversations forever altered by hindsight. But hindsight is a dangerous witness. Once tragedy occurs, ordinary behavior suddenly appears extraordinary. Silences become evidence. Pauses become warnings. Small disagreements become potential turning points. The human mind instinctively searches backward for causes, even when life rarely offers such simple explanations. Still, those who knew Ruth consistently described her as increasingly preoccupied during those final weeks. She was thinking, reflecting, trying, perhaps, to reconcile two versions of the same mother. One who had died in an accident. Another who had chosen to end her own suffering. Those are not easy realities for anyone to carry. Least of all someone only 16 years old. Once a family secret is exposed, it rarely remains confined to the moment of discovery. It begins spreading quietly through memory, touching conversations that once seemed ordinary, reshaping moments that had long been filed away as insignificant. A sentence spoken years earlier suddenly sounds different. A photograph once associated with happiness begins carrying an undercurrent of sadness. The mind becomes trapped in an endless process of reinterpreting the past. For Ruth, the truth about her mother's death may have marked the beginning of that process. No one can say exactly what she thought during those weeks. No one can honestly claim to know what emotions occupied her mind while she walked to school, sat through lessons, or stared out the window on dark November afternoons. To do so would be to invent certainty where none exists. What can be said is that those around her noticed she seemed different. Not dramatically. There was no sudden transformation that immediately alarmed everyone around her. Life rarely works that way. People expect emotional collapse to be loud, unmistakable, impossible to miss. More often, it is astonishingly quiet. Someone speaks a little less than usual. Someone laughs, but not quite as freely. Someone spends a little more time alone. None of those things seem remarkable in isolation. Together, they can suggest an inner world becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Friends later remembered Ruth as thoughtful, someone who often reflected deeply before speaking. She possessed an intelligence that was less about collecting facts than about asking questions. Questions about people. About motives. About fairness. There is a particular kind of curiosity that develops in teenagers who are trying to understand their own families. They begin recognizing that parents are not simply parents. They were once young themselves. They made mistakes. They carried fears. They kept secrets. As children, we often imagine adults possess complete control over their lives. Adolescence slowly dismantles that illusion. Parents become human. Flawed. Complicated. Capable of making decisions that children may never fully understand. For Ruth, this realization arrived alongside the discovery that one of the most important stories in her life had never been entirely true. That combination could only deepen the emotional distance she may already have been feeling. Whether she confronted her father directly about the death certificate has never been publicly established. Whether difficult conversations took place inside the family home remains largely private. Families experiencing emotional strain often continue performing ordinary routines while privately struggling beneath the surface. Breakfast is still prepared. School uniforms are still ironed. Dinner is still served. Life insists on moving forward, even when emotions refuse to cooperate. To outsiders, everything appears normal. Behind closed doors, however, silence can become louder than arguments. There is another detail about Ruth that quietly emerges through the memories of those who knew her. She was beginning to imagine a future beyond Betchworth. Like many 16-year-olds, she stood at the threshold of adulthood. School would not last forever. University, employment, independence, these possibilities slowly become tangible at that age. The world begins expanding beyond the familiar streets where childhood unfolded. Dreams take shape. Some remain vague. Others become powerful enough to influence every decision. For teenagers living in small villages, the future often feels suspended between excitement and uncertainty. The countryside that once seemed comforting can begin feeling restrictive. The same roads traveled since childhood suddenly appear too narrow. The same familiar faces too predictable. The desire to leave does not necessarily reflect unhappiness. Sometimes it is simply the natural consequence of growing older. Investigators would later hear that Ruth had spoken about wanting to leave home. Those remarks have become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Did they reflect an ordinary teenage wish for independence? Or did they reveal something far more significant? Without context, such statements resist easy interpretation. Almost every teenager has imagined escaping at some point. Leaving behind rules, responsibilities, arguments. Beginning somewhere entirely new. Most never act upon those thoughts. Fantasy and intention are not the same thing. Yet once someone disappears, even casual conversations become scrutinized with extraordinary intensity. Words that once seemed harmless begin carrying impossible weight. Every remembered sentence becomes potential evidence. Every forgotten detail becomes a source of regret. Friends find themselves asking whether they should have recognized something sooner. Parents wonder whether they overlooked signs hidden within everyday conversations. Teachers revisit ordinary classroom interactions searching for clues that did not seem important at the time. This retrospective search for meaning is almost universal in unresolved disappearances. It reflects not only grief but also the desperate hope that the truth might still be recoverable if only someone remembers one forgotten detail. Despite the questions surrounding her emotional state, there was little to suggest that Ruth had completely withdrawn from the people around her. She continued interacting with friends. She continued moving through ordinary life. That is another aspect of this case that has resisted simple explanation. Nothing about her behavior presented a clear, unmistakable path toward one conclusion. Instead, everything existed in shades of uncertainty. Perhaps the most unsettling feature of unresolved mysteries is that opposing explanations can coexist without cancelling each other out. Someone can appear hopeful while secretly struggling. Someone can make plans for the future while simultaneously questioning whether that future is attainable. Human behavior rarely follows the neat patterns audiences expect from fiction. Real life is contradictory. People laugh at funerals. They cry during weddings. They speak of tomorrow while fearing it may never arrive. Investigators understood this all too well. As they reconstructed Ruth's final weeks, they found themselves facing not one coherent narrative but several incomplete ones. One portrayed a teenager devastated by a life-changing revelation. Another described an intelligent young woman still engaging with friends and everyday responsibilities. Another hinted at someone contemplating significant change. None of these portraits excluded the others. All could be true simultaneously. This complexity would haunt the investigation for decades. There is also the question of memory itself. Every witness recalled Ruth through the lens of personal experience. A close friend noticed things that a teacher never would. A parent observed different details than a classmate. No single witness possessed the complete picture. Each carried only one small fragment. Together, those fragments formed an outline rather than a finished portrait. Imagine standing before a stained glass window after most of its pieces have fallen away. The remaining fragments still suggest an image. Colors remain. Certain lines are recognizable. Yet the complete picture has been permanently lost. That is how investigators came to know Ruth Wilson. Not as a fully preserved life, but through scattered recollections gathered from people whose own memories had been reshaped by tragedy. One friend remembered her kindness. Another remembered long conversations. Someone else recalled ordinary afternoons that suddenly became priceless simply because they could never happen again. Loss has a remarkable ability to transform routine into treasure. The last shared meal. The final joke. The goodbye that sounded no different from any other. Only afterward do people realize they have unknowingly witnessed the closing chapter of someone's story. In the weeks leading to November 27th, there were no newspaper headlines announcing danger. No police officers watching the Wilson home. No public appeals for information. Life continued with deceptive normality. Children still attended school. Shops still opened every morning. The village still settled into darkness each evening beneath the quiet rhythm of rural England. If there were storms gathering inside Ruth's mind, they remained invisible to almost everyone around her. That invisibility is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case. Human beings naturally believe suffering should reveal itself. We expect pain to announce its presence through dramatic changes, desperate conversations, obvious cries for help. Reality is often far subtler. Many people become remarkably skilled at appearing composed while privately carrying burdens no one else can see. Whether Ruth consciously concealed her thoughts or simply struggled to express them is impossible to know. What remains undeniable is that by late November 1995, she was moving toward a day that investigators would eventually reconstruct minute by minute. Every stop she made. Every purchase. Every conversation. Every decision. Because once she disappeared, the ordinary details of her final day would become the only map anyone possessed. And somewhere within those seemingly ordinary hours lay the answer to one of Britain's most enduring mysteries. The challenge was that no one realized they were witnessing the beginning of that mystery until it was already too late. The final weeks before November 27th unfolded with a deceptive sense of normality. If someone had stood outside the Wilson home each morning, they would have seen nothing extraordinary. The front door opened. People came and went. Cars passed along the narrow village roads. Schoolchildren drifted toward classrooms beneath grey autumn skies. The rhythm of life continued with the quiet predictability that defines small English villages. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing announced itself as the beginning of a tragedy. Yet history has a habit of disguising its turning points. The moments that eventually divide a family's life into before and after rarely look significant while they are happening. They resemble every other ordinary day. Only later do they acquire meaning. For Ruth, those final weeks existed within that invisible space between ordinary life and irreversible mystery. She was still only 16. Old enough to imagine adulthood. Young enough that the adults around her still believed they could protect her from the harshest truths. Perhaps that belief had always motivated the decision to conceal the reality of her mother's death. It is easy to judge such decisions decades later, armed with hindsight and distance. It is far more difficult to imagine the impossible position facing grieving parents in the early 1980s. How do you explain suicide to a 3-year-old child? At what age does that conversation become appropriate? 5? 10? 16? There is no universal answer. Every family arrives at that crossroads differently. Some choose complete honesty from the beginning. Others wait until children appear emotionally mature enough to understand. Some never find the courage to revisit the subject at all. Whether the Wilson family intended to reveal the truth eventually or hoped it would remain hidden forever is something only they could truly answer. What is certain is that fate intervened before any planned conversation could take place. A document was discovered. A secret ended. And from that moment onward, Ruth's understanding of her own history became permanently altered. Psychologists who study family dynamics often describe identity as a story people tell themselves about who they are and where they come from. Parents become the first authors of that story. They explain childhood, family, loss, love. When one of those foundational chapters suddenly changes, the entire narrative demands to be rewritten. For Ruth, the revision was profound. The mother she had mourned for years had not simply been taken by chance. She had died in circumstances that carried emotional complexity far beyond the explanation Ruth had always accepted. Suicide leaves behind questions that no official record can answer. What pain was hidden from the world? Did anyone notice? Could anything have changed the outcome? Children who lose parents to suicide often wrestle with another fear that is seldom spoken aloud. They wonder whether suffering can somehow be inherited. Whether sadness travels through bloodlines. Whether one person's despair becomes another person's destiny. There is absolutely no evidence that Ruth experienced those fears. But mental health professionals recognize them as common among surviving family members. The uncertainty surrounding her emotional response is another reminder of how much of this story remains forever unknowable. Investigators were careful not to confuse possibility with proof. That distinction became essential because speculation rapidly filled the enormous gaps left by Ruth's disappearance. Every unanswered question attracted another theory. Every coincidence invited interpretation. Yet evidence remained stubbornly limited. The challenge was never finding ideas. It was finding facts capable of surviving scrutiny. People often assume that missing person investigations begin with dramatic discoveries. A torn piece of clothing. A mysterious stranger. A threatening letter. Most begin far more quietly. Investigators first attempt to understand the missing individual as completely as possible. Not because they believe personality alone solves mysteries, but because human behavior provides context for every subsequent decision. Who was Ruth Wilson? Not the name that would eventually appear in newspapers. Not the face reproduced on missing posters across Britain. But the real teenager whose disappearance transformed countless ordinary memories into priceless fragments. She was a daughter. A sister. A student. A friend. Someone whose future, like that of every 16-year-old, existed almost entirely in possibility rather than certainty. There were examinations still to complete. Adult responsibilities still waiting beyond the horizon. Experiences she had not yet lived. Mistakes she had not yet made. Dreams that had barely begun taking shape. That unfinished future is one of the reasons unresolved disappearances remain so emotionally powerful. Murder investigations, devastating as they are, eventually confront undeniable reality. Families are forced into mourning. Justice, however imperfect, may still be pursued. Missing person cases deny even that. They preserve possibility. Hope survives alongside despair. Every unidentified photograph becomes significant. Every reported sighting demands investigation. Every anonymous telephone call briefly raises expectations before disappointment returns. The absence itself becomes permanent. That emotional uncertainty would eventually define the Wilson family's lives. But in late November 1995, they could not yet imagine what lay ahead. To them, Ruth was simply a teenager moving through another school term. No one possessed the perspective that only history would provide. No one recognized that seemingly insignificant decisions were about to become some of the most carefully analyzed actions in modern British missing person investigations. In retrospect, there is a haunting contrast between the peaceful appearance of rural Surrey and the invisible emotional currents flowing beneath its surface. The countryside seemed almost designed to inspire calm. Ancient oak trees stretched across gently rolling hills. Stone walls divided quiet fields where sheep grazed undisturbed. Morning mist drifted lazily through valleys before dissolving beneath weak winter sunlight. Visitors often described the area as picturesque. Safe. Almost timeless. Yet landscapes possess no moral character. Beauty offers no protection against tragedy. Some of history's darkest mysteries have unfolded in places of extraordinary peace. Perhaps that contrast makes them even more unsettling. It reminds us that danger rarely announces itself through surroundings. It emerges from circumstances, from choices, from chance. As November drew toward its final days, daylight shortened noticeably. Afternoons faded into evening with surprising speed. Cold rain became increasingly common. People hurried indoors earlier than they had only weeks before. The approaching winter seemed to encourage quiet routines. Families gathered around dinner tables. Curtains closed against the darkness. Village streets emptied long before bedtime. Within this familiar rhythm, Ruth continued living what appeared, from the outside, to be an ordinary life. No one could see the complete picture. Perhaps there was no complete picture to see. Human lives rarely unfold according to a single explanation. Emotions overlap. Conflicts coexist with affection. Hope survives beside disappointment. One person can simultaneously long for change while fearing it. That complexity would become the defining obstacle facing every detective assigned to Ruth's case. There would never be one obvious motive. Never one unmistakable suspect. Never one clear path leading toward certainty. Instead, investigators would encounter a young woman whose final known actions seemed to point in different directions at the same time. Some suggested careful planning. Others suggested emotional turmoil. Still others hinted at the possibility of an encounter with someone whose identity has never been established. Those contradictions did not begin on the day Ruth disappeared. They began with understanding the person she had become during those final weeks. A teenager standing at one of life's most uncertain crossroads. Caught between childhood and adulthood. Between trust and doubt. Between the story she had always believed about her family. And the truth she had only recently uncovered. The revelation about her mother's death did not provide investigators with an answer. Instead, it became the first of many questions. A question that would cast a long shadow over every theory that followed. Because when Ruth Wilson left home on the morning of November 27, 1995, she was not simply carrying a school bag or a coat against the rain. She was carrying the weight of a family history that had been rewritten only weeks before. Whether that burden shaped what happened next remains one of the greatest unanswered questions in the entire case. What is known beyond dispute is this. Before detectives searched Box Hill. Before helicopters scanned the treetops. Before newspapers printed her smiling school photograph beneath bold headlines asking where she had gone. There was a single ordinary Monday. A grey sky. A quiet village. And a 16-year-old girl who walked out of her front door, leaving behind a life that, until then, had seemed as ordinary as any other. The hours that followed would become one of the most meticulously reconstructed days in British true crime history, not because anyone witnessed a crime, but because no one did. And it is within those ordinary hours, beginning with the morning Ruth chose not to attend school, that the mystery truly begins to unfold. At 16 years old, Ruth Wilson occupied that fragile space between who she had been and who she was still becoming. It is an age filled with contradictions. Young enough to still need guidance. Old enough to believe independence is only one decision away. One moment, the world feels impossibly small, confined to classrooms, family dinners, and familiar roads that have been walked 1,000 times. The next, it seems unimaginably vast, stretching beyond every hill and every railway station toward cities, universities, careers, and lives yet to be lived. Most people remember 16 not because life was simple, but because every emotion felt permanent. Every disappointment seemed capable of lasting forever. Every dream appeared just within reach. Every secret carried enormous weight. For Ruth, those contradictions were intensified by circumstances that very few of her classmates could fully understand. She had grown up with absence. Not the temporary absence created by long workdays or distant relatives, but the permanent absence of a mother whose face existed more clearly in photographs than in memory. Children who lose a parent very young often spend years constructing an image of that person from fragments. Stories told by grandparents. Comments overheard during family gatherings. Old birthday cards tucked inside drawers. The expression frozen forever in faded photographs. Each fragment becomes another brushstroke in a portrait they are forever trying to complete. Yet no matter how many stories survive, there is always an empty space that can never truly be filled. No memory of being comforted after a nightmare. No recollection of a familiar voice calling from another room. No certainty about what it felt like to hold their hand. Instead, there is imagination. And imagination has a remarkable ability to transform ordinary people into almost mythical figures. Perhaps Ruth sometimes wondered whether she had inherited her mother's smile. Or her sense of humor. Perhaps she searched old photographs looking for similarities in the shape of her eyes or the way she stood. Children often search for pieces of themselves inside the parents they barely remember. Not because they are living in the past, but because understanding where we come from is one of the first steps toward understanding who we are. Friends remembered Ruth as thoughtful. Not withdrawn. Not antisocial. Simply someone who often seemed more comfortable listening than competing to be heard. In classrooms, there are always students who naturally become the center of attention. Then there are those whose presence is quieter, whose influence emerges not through volume but through kindness, curiosity, and observation. Ruth belonged more naturally to the second group. She did not need to dominate conversations to become part of them. She possessed the sort of personality that encouraged people to speak openly. Perhaps because she listened without rushing to interrupt. Perhaps because she appeared genuinely interested in what others had to say. Kindness rarely attracts headlines. It leaves no dramatic evidence. But after someone disappears, it becomes one of the qualities friends remember most vividly. Small gestures begin resurfacing. Helping someone carry books. Waiting for a friend after class. Sharing lunch without making a point of it. Acts so ordinary that they seem almost invisible while life continues normally. Only afterward do they become treasured memories. Like every teenager, Ruth lived within routines that quietly shaped her world. School mornings followed familiar patterns. Lessons blended into one another across weeks and months. Weekends offered brief freedom before another Monday inevitably arrived. The predictability of adolescence often disguises how rapidly young people are changing beneath the surface. Adults sometimes imagine teenage years as repetitive. Teenagers experience them very differently. Each month brings subtle shifts in confidence, friendships, ambitions, and identity. Someone who enters a school year uncertain of themselves may finish it feeling like an entirely different person. Growth during adolescence is rarely visible day by day. Only when looking backward does its pace become astonishing. Ruth stood at precisely that stage of life. The future was beginning to demand decisions. School would not continue forever. Soon there would be examinations, choices about higher education, employment, independence. Questions that had once belonged to distant adulthood were steadily moving closer. For many young people, that transition is exciting. For others, it is frightening. Often, it is both at the same time. Those who knew Ruth suggested she possessed an intelligence that extended beyond academic ability. She seemed reflective. Interested not only in what people did but why they did it. Some personalities naturally seek explanations beneath appearances. A casual conversation becomes something worth analyzing. A family story invites deeper questions. A passing comment lingers in the mind long after everyone else has forgotten it. Such curiosity can become both a strength and a burden. It encourages empathy. It also makes unanswered questions especially difficult to ignore. After discovering the truth surrounding her mother's death, it is not difficult to imagine how naturally that curiosity might have turned inward. Again, imagination must never replace evidence. No one can honestly describe Ruth's private thoughts during those final weeks. But it is reasonable to understand why someone with a reflective personality might struggle to reconcile two entirely different versions of the same family history. Identity is built from stories. When those stories change, identity itself begins shifting. Perhaps Ruth found herself looking at family photographs differently. Perhaps conversations that once seemed ordinary suddenly carried uncomfortable silence. Perhaps she simply needed time to process what she had learned. There is no evidence that she shared every thought with friends. Many teenagers don't. Some fears feel too personal to explain. Some disappointments seem impossible to translate into words. Instead, they are carried quietly from one day to the next, hidden beneath conversations about homework, music, films, and weekend plans. Outwardly, life continues. Internally, everything may feel different. That contrast between appearance and reality lies at the heart of so many missing person cases. Investigators repeatedly encounter individuals who seemed perfectly ordinary to those around them. Neighbors describe them as cheerful. Co-workers remember nothing unusual. Friends insist they seemed fine only days earlier. Such accounts are rarely dishonest. They simply reflect the limits of human observation. We can recognize expressions. We cannot always recognize hidden thoughts. The version of ourselves presented to the world is rarely identical to the one carried privately. For Ruth, the world continued seeing an intelligent 16-year-old navigating the familiar routines of school and village life. What no one could fully observe was the emotional landscape developing beneath those routines. Perhaps even Ruth herself had not fully understood it. Adolescence is often the first period in life when emotions become too complex to name easily. People speak of happiness and sadness as though they exist separately. Reality is seldom so simple. Hope can exist beside grief. Love beside resentment. Curiosity beside fear. One emotion rarely replaces another. Instead, they accumulate. Young people frequently experience those contradictions with extraordinary intensity because they have not yet developed the experience needed to place them into perspective. A disappointment that an adult might recognize as temporary can feel absolute at 16. Likewise, a new possibility can seem capable of transforming an entire life overnight. There is another reason Ruth's age remains so significant. 16 is an age at which independence begins taking physical form. Teenagers travel alone. Make decisions without parents. Build friendships that increasingly shape their identity. Explore places beyond the immediate boundaries of home. Each new freedom expands opportunity. It also expands vulnerability. Parents gradually loosen their grip because growing children need room to become adults. No parent can accompany a 16-year-old everywhere. Trust becomes essential. Responsibility becomes shared. That ordinary process unfolded for Ruth just as it does for millions of teenagers. Nothing about her independence appeared extraordinary. She moved through her community with the confidence expected of someone her age. She visited friends. Spent time in town. Made decisions about how to spend afternoons. These were not warning signs. They were ordinary milestones of adolescence. The tragedy is that ordinary freedoms sometimes become the setting in which extraordinary mysteries begin. By every public account, Ruth's life was not defined by chaos. There were no repeated encounters with the police. No pattern of running away from home. No widely reported history of violent confrontations or reckless behavior that might have led investigators toward an obvious explanation after she disappeared. That absence of dramatic warning signs is one of the reasons her case remains so difficult to understand. When detectives investigate a disappearance, they begin by asking simple questions. Who was this person? What did they value? Who mattered most to them? What kind of future were they trying to build? The answers rarely solve the case by themselves, but they provide the emotional landscape within which every decision must eventually be understood. In Ruth's case, that landscape was filled with ordinary teenage experiences that, after her disappearance, became almost unbearably precious to the people who remembered them. Friends recalled conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time. Walking home after school. Sharing jokes that no one bothered to write down. Discussing teachers, homework, television, music, and the endless small dramas that dominate adolescence. There was comfort in those routines. At 16, friendships often become a second family. Teenagers begin revealing parts of themselves to friends that they struggle to express at home. Dreams are spoken aloud. Embarrassments become shared secrets. Anxieties that seem impossible to explain to parents somehow become easier to confess to someone sitting beside you in a classroom. Friendships at that age possess an extraordinary intensity. Every conversation feels important. Every misunderstanding feels enormous. Every act of kindness remains unforgettable. It is within those friendships that investigators later found another small but intriguing detail. In the days before she vanished, Ruth had reportedly treated some of her friends to food, insisting on paying herself. On the surface, there was nothing extraordinary about buying lunch. Teenagers do small favors for one another all the time. Someone forgets their money. Someone else offers to pay. The favor is usually returned another day. Ordinarily, no one remembers such moments for very long. After a disappearance, however, even the smallest gesture begins attracting attention. Investigators asked the same question everyone else eventually asked. Why? Was it simply generosity? Or was it a farewell disguised as an ordinary afternoon? The painful truth is that both explanations remain possible. Human behavior rarely announces its intentions. One person buys lunch because they happen to have extra money. Another does so because they want to leave behind one final pleasant memory. The action looks identical. Only the motive changes. Unfortunately, motives cannot be photographed. They cannot be collected as evidence. They exist inside the mind of the individual, and sometimes they disappear with them forever. This uncertainty would become a defining feature of Ruth's story. Almost every meaningful detail surrounding her final days can be interpreted in more than one way. Each interpretation appears convincing until another fact complicates it. Some investigators have suggested that this is precisely why the case has endured for decades. It refuses to settle into a single narrative. There is always another possibility waiting just beyond the edge of certainty. People who knew Ruth also described someone capable of genuine warmth. She was not remembered as manipulative or calculating. Nothing publicly known about her personality suggested someone carefully constructing an elaborate deception over many months. If she had planned to disappear voluntarily, she concealed that intention with remarkable consistency. If she had not, then many of her final actions become even more difficult to explain. Both paths lead back into uncertainty. There is another aspect of adolescence that investigators quietly considered. 16-year-olds often experience emotions with extraordinary immediacy. A disagreement that feels devastating on Monday may seem insignificant by Friday. Likewise, moments of inspiration can trigger sudden decisions that appear impulsive to everyone else. Adults sometimes mistake this emotional intensity for irrationality. In reality, adolescence is a period during which the brain is still developing its ability to balance emotion and long-term planning. That does not mean teenagers are incapable of thoughtful decisions. Far from it. It simply means feelings often occupy a larger space in decision-making than they do later in life. Whether that reality played any role in Ruth's disappearance remains impossible to establish. What investigators could confirm was that she had recently experienced one of the most emotionally significant revelations of her young life. How that revelation influenced her thinking is something no detective could ever prove. There is also the question of trust. Trust forms quietly over years. It develops through countless ordinary interactions that rarely attract attention. Parents keeping promises. Friends protecting confidences. Teachers offering encouragement. Once damaged, however, trust rarely breaks cleanly. It fractures. People begin questioning not only the specific lie they discovered but every surrounding memory. If one important truth had been hidden, what else might also be incomplete? Again, there is no evidence that Ruth consciously adopted such thinking. But psychologists recognize this pattern as a common response when individuals discover long-concealed family secrets. The revelation often extends beyond the secret itself. It reshapes the way people interpret their relationships. Perhaps this is why Ruth's story continues to resonate so deeply with audiences decades later. It is not merely the mystery of her disappearance. It is the emotional complexity that preceded it. Many people recognize pieces of themselves within that complexity. Not the disappearance, but the experience of discovering that families are more complicated than childhood once allowed them to believe. Every family preserves certain silences. Some are harmless. Others carry enormous emotional weight. The difference often becomes clear only years later. As investigators attempted to understand Ruth, they faced another frustrating limitation. There were no social media accounts documenting every passing thought. No smartphone containing years of messages. No location history mapping every movement. The world of 1995 was profoundly different from today. Teenagers communicated face to face. Telephone conversations disappeared the moment they ended. Letters remained private unless someone chose to share them. A person's inner life was far less visible than it would be now. Modern investigators often reconstruct lives through digital footprints. Search histories. Text messages. Photographs. Online conversations. None of those resources existed in Ruth's case. Instead, detectives relied upon memory. Witness interviews. Paper records. Receipts. Taxi logs. Library visits. Each fragment had to be gathered patiently, like pieces of a mosaic scattered across an entire community. That process demanded extraordinary care. Memories fade quickly. Within days, certainty begins softening around the edges. People unconsciously fill gaps without realizing they are doing so. One witness remembers a conversation differently from another. Neither intends deception. Memory simply evolves over time. Investigators therefore searched constantly for details supported by independent evidence rather than recollection alone. This careful distinction between evidence and interpretation would become essential because public fascination with Ruth's disappearance grew rapidly. The fewer confirmed facts available, the more speculation emerged to fill the empty spaces. Some theories portrayed Ruth as deeply distressed. Others imagined a carefully planned escape. Still others focused on the possibility of an unknown individual entering her life shortly before she vanished. Each theory found supporters. None found proof. At the center of every discussion remained the same quiet 16-year-old whose ordinary life had suddenly become the subject of extraordinary scrutiny. The irony is difficult to ignore. During her lifetime, Ruth enjoyed the privacy most teenagers take for granted. After her disappearance, almost every known detail of her life became a matter of public interest. Conversations were revisited. Decisions analyzed. Personality traits debated. People searched desperately for the one overlooked clue that might explain everything. Yet the more closely investigators examined Ruth's life, the more they encountered complexity rather than certainty. She was not easily reduced to a stereotype. Not simply a troubled teenager. Not simply a happy one. Not obviously planning to leave forever. Not obviously preparing to end her life. She remained, above all else, a real person. Someone whose emotions, like everyone else's, were layered, contradictory, and impossible to summarize with a single explanation. And perhaps that is the greatest challenge in understanding Ruth Wilson. The temptation is always to search backward until one moment appears to explain everything that followed. Real life rarely grants such simplicity. Lives are not built upon single moments. They are shaped by hundreds of experiences, large and small, each influencing the next in ways that even the individuals themselves may never fully understand. By late November 1995, Ruth's story was still being written. No one around her imagined they were approaching its final confirmed chapter. To her friends, she was simply Ruth. A classmate. A companion. A familiar face whose absence was, at that moment, still unimaginable. Within days, those same friends would find themselves replaying every recent conversation, wondering whether something important had been hidden inside words that had once sounded completely ordinary. For those who loved Ruth, the hardest part of her disappearance was not only losing her presence. It was losing the certainty that had always surrounded her existence. Before November 27, 1995, Ruth was a person moving through the world in ordinary ways. She had a bedroom. A family. Friends who expected to see her again. Teachers who expected her to return to school. A future that, although uncertain like every teenager's future, still seemed open and full of possibilities. After that day, she became a question. Where is Ruth? What happened to Ruth? Why did Ruth leave? The transformation from person to mystery is one of the cruelest experiences a family can endure. A missing person case forces everyone involved to live between two impossible realities. The first reality is hope. The belief that somewhere, somehow, the person they love is still alive. The second reality is fear. The awareness that every passing day without answers makes the worst possibilities harder to ignore. For Ruth's family, that uncertainty would become a permanent part of life. But before she became the subject of searches and newspaper reports, she was simply a daughter trying to understand where she came from. Her relationship with her family was inevitably shaped by the absence of her mother. Loss creates invisible spaces inside families. Some are filled with stories. Some are filled with photographs. Some remain empty because there are questions nobody knows how to answer. Ruth's mother, Nesta, existed in the family not only as someone who had died, but as someone whose absence influenced the lives of those who remained. Every family has defining moments. Births. Deaths. Marriages. Separations. Events that divide life into chapters. For Ruth, her mother's death was the earliest defining event of her childhood. She grew up knowing there was a missing piece in her family story. She simply believed she understood why it was missing. Then the discovery of the truth changed everything. It is difficult to underestimate the emotional impact of learning that a parent did not die in the way you had always believed. The pain comes in layers. First comes the loss itself. Then comes the shock of discovering that the loss had another meaning. Then comes the realization that the people around you knew something you did not. For Ruth, the revelation arrived during a period of life already filled with transition. 16 is an age when people naturally begin separating themselves from childhood. They question family traditions. They challenge explanations. They seek independence. They begin deciding which parts of their upbringing they want to carry forward and which parts they want to leave behind. The discovery about her mother placed Ruth in a position where she had to reconsider something much deeper than a single family event. She had to reconsider the story of herself. Where did she come from? What had she inherited from her parents? How much of the person she was becoming was shaped by things she knew? And how much was shaped by things hidden from her? Those questions do not have simple answers. They are the kind of questions that can follow someone for years. Perhaps the most painful aspect was that Ruth never had the opportunity to discuss those questions openly in the way many people eventually do. She disappeared before anyone could know what answers she might have found. Before she could explain what she felt. Before she could tell her family whether she was angry, hurt, confused, or simply overwhelmed. The silence left behind became permanent. Friends who knew Ruth found themselves facing a painful contradiction. They remembered someone who could be warm, considerate, and engaged with the world around her. Yet they also remembered that she had recently been dealing with a revelation powerful enough to shake her understanding of her own family. Both things could exist together. A person can still laugh while carrying sadness. A person can still make plans while struggling internally. A person can still care deeply about others while feeling lost themselves. This complexity is often overlooked when people attempt to understand disappearances. There is a temptation to search for a single explanation. One event. One emotion. One reason. But human beings are rarely that simple. Ruth was not defined only by the secret she discovered. She was not defined only by the day she vanished. She was a complete person with years of experiences before that moment. She had relationships, preferences, memories, private thoughts, small habits that belonged only to her. Those details matter because every missing person deserves to be remembered as more than a mystery. Before she became a name attached to an unsolved case, Ruth was a teenager with people who cared about her. A friend whose absence would be noticed. A daughter whose empty bedroom would become a painful reminder of everything unfinished. A sister whose place in the family could never simply be replaced. The public often encounters missing people through the final moments of their stories. A photograph. A date. A location. A last known sighting. But every disappearance begins much earlier. It begins with a life already being lived. With ordinary mornings. Ordinary conversations. Ordinary hopes. The tragedy is that those ordinary moments only become visible after they are gone. When investigators later examined Ruth's final days, they looked for signs that might explain her decisions. But perhaps the most important thing they found was not a clue. It was a reminder of who she had been. Someone young. Someone thoughtful. Someone standing at the beginning of adulthood. Someone whose story should have continued. That is what makes the Ruth Wilson case so haunting. It is not only about a girl who disappeared. It is about a future that disappeared with her. The places she might have visited. The people she might have met. The experiences she never had the chance to live. Every missing person case carries that same invisible loss. The world does not only lose the person. It loses every version of the future that person might have created. For Ruth, those possibilities remain frozen in time. She never reached 17. She never experienced the next stage of independence waiting beyond adolescence. She never had the chance to explain herself. To defend herself. To change her mind. To tell the world what happened in her own words. And perhaps that is why the unanswered questions surrounding her disappearance continue to feel so powerful. Because every theory, every investigation, every search ultimately returns to one simple truth. A 16-year-old girl left home on a rainy November morning. She had a history. She had people who loved her. She had questions she wanted answered. And then, somewhere between the familiar world she knew and the unknown place where she vanished, her story was interrupted. The next chapter would not be written by Ruth herself. It would be written by investigators, witnesses, journalists, and a family desperately searching for answers. The quiet village of Betchworth was about to become the starting point of a mystery that would reach far beyond its borders. And the first question waiting for everyone was the simplest one imaginable. What happened on the day Ruth Wilson disappeared, November the 27th, 1995, began like any other Monday in Surrey. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. There was no visible sign that the day would become the final confirmed chapter in Ruth Wilson's life. No dramatic event announced itself. No one watching from a distance would have noticed anything unusual about a teenage girl leaving home on a cold November morning. The world continued moving. People went to work. Children went to school. Shops opened their doors. Cars traveled along familiar roads. The ordinary machinery of life continued without hesitation. And somewhere within that ordinary morning, Ruth Wilson stepped into a day that would eventually become one of Britain's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The weather matched the mood that would later surround the case. The sky was heavy and colourless, typical of late autumn in Surrey. The warmth of summer had long disappeared. The trees were stripped of their leaves, leaving dark branches exposed against the pale November sky. The countryside looked quieter than usual, almost as if winter had already begun settling over the landscape. Rain fell intermittently throughout the day. Not a violent storm. Not the kind of weather that forces people indoors. Just a persistent cold rain that covered roads, paths, and fields with a thin layer of dampness. The type of rain that makes people pull their coats tighter. The type that leaves footprints fading quickly into muddy ground. For Ruth, however, the weather did not stop her from leaving home. She was 16 years old. At that age, teenagers often move through the world with a level of independence that feels completely normal to them. They travel alone. They visit shops. They spend hours away from home without every movement being monitored. In 1995, before smartphones and constant digital tracking, young people had far more privacy than many do today. A teenager could leave the house and disappear into the rhythm of a town for an entire afternoon. That was not unusual. That was life. Ruth's family likely expected that day to follow the same familiar pattern. A morning departure. School. An afternoon return. Perhaps dinner together in the evening. A conversation about ordinary things. Homework. Plans. The small details that fill family life but rarely feel important at the time. No one knew that evening would arrive without Ruth walking back through the door. No one knew that the next few hours would transform every ordinary detail of her day into evidence. The first confirmed detail of Ruth's movements was that she did not attend school. Why she chose not to go remains one of the unanswered questions surrounding the case. Was it planned? Was it spontaneous? Was it connected to the emotional turmoil she had experienced after discovering the truth about her mother? Or was there another reason entirely? Investigators would later examine this decision carefully because missing a normal school day can mean many different things. For some teenagers, it is simply an act of rebellion. A desire for freedom. A need for space. For others, it can represent something more serious. A moment when ordinary routines are abandoned because something else has taken priority. With Ruth, the meaning remains uncertain. What is known is that she did not simply stay at home. She left. And during the hours that followed, she moved through several locations in a way that suggested planning rather than confusion. Her first known stop was a florist. A detail that initially appeared harmless would later become one of the most emotionally significant pieces of the investigation. Ruth ordered flowers for her stepmother. The choice itself was unusual enough to attract attention after her disappearance. Flowers are rarely meaningless. They are associated with important moments. Birthdays, apologies, celebrations, goodbyes. Yet Ruth did not request immediate delivery. She asked for them to be delivered 2 days later. That small detail created one of the many contradictions at the center of the case. If Ruth intended to return home, the delayed delivery could have been completely ordinary. Perhaps she simply wanted to arrange a thoughtful gesture in advance. Perhaps she had a reason for choosing that particular date. But if she knew she would not return, the timing carried a very different meaning. A message that would arrive after her absence had already been discovered. A final act of kindness reaching someone when Ruth herself could no longer deliver it. The florist who accepted the order could not know the significance of that moment. To them, Ruth was simply another customer. A young girl making a request. A brief interaction among thousands that take place in a shop every year. Only later would that memory become connected to something much darker. This pattern would repeat throughout the investigation. Small moments. Ordinary decisions. Details that seemed meaningless until they were viewed through the lens of disappearance. After leaving the florist, Ruth continued to Dorking. The journey from Betchworth to Dorking was not unusual. The towns were connected by familiar roads, and Ruth would have known the area well. Dorking was a place where teenagers could spend time without attracting attention. Shops. Libraries. Cafes. Public spaces where someone could exist anonymously among hundreds of other people. That anonymity would later become one of the greatest challenges for investigators. In a crowded town, a person can be surrounded by witnesses and still remain unseen. Hundreds of faces pass each other every day. Most are forgotten moments later. Ruth entered the library and remained there for several hours. Again, this was a detail that seemed completely ordinary. Libraries are places people visit for countless reasons. To study. To read. To escape the weather. To spend time alone. For Ruth, it may have offered exactly that, a quiet place away from the emotional pressure surrounding her. A place where she could sit with her thoughts. A place where nobody demanded answers. A place where the world moved more slowly. But what she did inside the library remains unknown. There was no documented conversation that revealed her intentions. No statement from another visitor that explained what was happening in her mind. Only the knowledge that she spent a significant amount of time there before leaving. Those hours became another blank space in the timeline. A gap investigators would later attempt to fill. What was Ruth thinking? Was she writing? Reading? Planning? Waiting? Was she simply passing time before an appointment or meeting? Or was she trying to decide what she would do next? The truth disappeared with her. By approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ruth left Dorking and made the decision that would become the defining moment of the case. She called a taxi. The destination she gave was Box Hill. A place of natural beauty. A place known for its views across the Surrey countryside. A place that, under different circumstances, might have represented peace and solitude. But on that afternoon, beneath dark skies and falling rain, it became the final known location connected to Ruth Wilson. The taxi journey itself was short. But every detail of it would later be examined. The driver. The route. The conversation. Ruth's behavior. The weather. The exact location where she asked to be dropped off. Because when a person disappears without explanation, the last confirmed moments of their life become more than memories. They become the final pieces of a puzzle. And for Ruth Wilson, the final piece was a rainy road on Box Hill. A taxi stopping. A door opening. A 16-year-old girl stepping out alone. And a driver watching as she remained there, motionless. For reasons no one has ever been able to determine, the taxi ride toward Box Hill lasted only a short time. Yet within the investigation that followed, those minutes became some of the most important moments ever reconstructed. A journey that, at the time, seemed completely ordinary would later be examined repeatedly by police officers, journalists, and anyone trying to understand what happened to Ruth Wilson. Because the final journey of a missing person is often filled with painful significance. The driver did not know he was carrying someone who would soon become the center of a national mystery. He was not transporting a frightened passenger fleeing danger. He was not responding to an emergency. He was simply doing his job. A customer entered his taxi. A destination was given. The vehicle moved through the familiar sorry roads. The rain continued falling outside. The world remained unaware. Inside the taxi, Ruth sat quietly. There is no record suggesting that she appeared distressed during the journey. She did not tell the driver she was in trouble. She did not ask for help. She did not mention anyone following her. She behaved in a way that, at first glance, appeared completely normal. This detail would later become one of the most difficult aspects of the case to interpret. Because people expect moments before tragedy to look different. They imagine fear being obvious. They imagine desperation revealing itself. They imagine someone behaving in a way that tells the world something is wrong. But real human beings do not always work that way. A person can carry enormous emotional pain and still appear calm. A person can make a decision that changes everything while maintaining a completely ordinary conversation. The outside world sees only the surface. The private thoughts remain hidden. As the taxi moved away from the more populated areas, the landscape gradually changed. Dorking and its familiar streets gave way to quieter roads. The countryside opened around them. Fields stretched into the distance. Trees stood bare against the grey sky. The rain softened the outlines of everything beyond the windows. Surrey in late November has a particular kind of beauty. It is not the bright, colourful beauty of summer. It is darker. More restrained. The landscape feels older. The forests appear deeper. The roads seem to disappear into the horizon. For someone seeking solitude, it can feel peaceful. For someone searching for answers, it can feel endless. Box Hill was not a strange place for Ruth to visit. It was not some unknown wilderness miles away from civilization. People had walked those paths for generations. Families came there for afternoon outings. Hikers followed the trails. Visitors stopped to admire the views. But the location Ruth chose was important. She did not ask to be taken to a busy area. She did not request a popular meeting point. She directed the driver toward a quieter stretch near a path away from the main activity. That decision would become one of the greatest mysteries surrounding her disappearance. Because it suggested intention. She knew where she wanted to go. She had a destination in mind. But the reason behind that destination remained hidden. Investigators would later consider several possibilities. Perhaps Ruth had chosen the location because she wanted to be alone. Perhaps she wanted somewhere private to think. Perhaps she was meeting someone. Or perhaps she had been persuaded to go there by someone whose identity has never been discovered. Each possibility creates a different version of the final moments of her life. And each version leaves unanswered questions. If she was meeting someone, who was that person? Why has no one ever been identified? Why did Ruth choose such an isolated location? If she intended to be alone, why leave behind signs that appeared to connect her final hours with the people closest to her? If she planned to disappear, why create actions that seemed to leave emotional traces behind? The taxi continued through the rain. Eventually, Ruth asked the driver to stop. The vehicle slowed. The engine remained running. The driver looked toward his passenger. For him, this was simply another drop-off. Another customer reaching the end of a journey. He had no reason to believe this moment would remain in his memory forever. Ruth paid the fare. She stepped outside. And then came the detail that would become impossible to forget. She did not immediately leave. She stood there. The driver watched her through the window. The rain fell around her. She looked toward the surroundings. The road. The trees. The empty space ahead. It appeared as though she was waiting. That single observation created countless questions. Waiting for whom? Waiting for what? Was she uncertain? Was she expecting a person to arrive? Was she gathering courage before moving forward? Or was she simply taking a moment before continuing along the path? A few seconds can mean nothing. A few seconds can mean everything. The driver eventually continued his journey. His taxi disappeared from the area. Ruth remained behind. That was the last confirmed sighting. A teenager alone on a rainy afternoon. A quiet road. A landscape that offered no explanation. From that point forward, the timeline becomes uncertain. The next moments belong entirely to speculation. Some believe Ruth followed the path into the surrounding area. Some believe she may have met another person. Some believe the answer lies in the letters and items discovered later. But none of those possibilities has ever been proven. The cruel reality is that the final confirmed sighting contains no obvious clue. There is no struggle. No witness reporting an argument. No sound of distress. No moment when someone saw danger approaching. Only a girl stepping out of a taxi. Only a driver watching her stand still. Only an ordinary action that became extraordinary because nothing happened afterward. As evening approached, the weather continued to close in. The daylight faded. The temperature dropped. The countryside became increasingly empty. A place that looked peaceful during the day became something entirely different after dark. Paths became harder to follow. Trees blocked visibility. The rain covered surfaces and erased traces. For investigators arriving later, the environment itself became another challenge. The very landscape that made Box Hill beautiful also made it difficult to search. Nature does not preserve human stories. It does not protect evidence. It does not remember footsteps. The ground absorbs rain. The wind moves through trees. The darkness hides details. By nightfall, Ruth Wilson was missing. But at first, the full meaning of that fact had not yet become clear. Many missing person cases begin with a period of uncertainty. Families wait. They call friends. They assume there must be a simple explanation. Someone stayed late. Someone lost track of time. Someone will walk through the door soon and apologize for causing worry. Hope delays panic. It is a natural human response. Nobody wants to immediately accept that something terrible may have happened. But as the hours passed, concern began growing. Ruth was not simply late. She was unreachable. And the events of her day began forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The missed school. The flowers ordered for a future delivery. The hours spent alone in Dorking. The taxi to Box Hill. The final image of her standing in the rain. Individually, each detail could be explained. Together, they created a mystery. A mystery that would send search teams into the Surrey countryside. A mystery that would force investigators to examine every possibility. A mystery that would leave one family trapped between hope and heartbreak for decades. Because the question was no longer where Ruth had gone for the afternoon. The question had become something far more frightening. Where had Ruth Wilson disappeared to?